eli5 Why is it so important to capture the capital city in a war? Prior to Napoleon, it was regarded as vitally important as they contained most of the production as well as the seat of government, so those cities were well protected, so by capturing him you had basically defeated the country. Napoleon focused on defeating the opposing army in the field rather than on cities. This meant his mobile armies weren't tied to one location while besieging a city. By defeating the opposing armies meant that there were no troops left to defend cities, so they then surrendered when his armies were near rather than risk being destroyed. Many capital cities are located at strategic transportation hubs or near vital resources, so there could be strategic reasons to capture it. It could disrupt the enemy's command and control. It could have effect on morale for both your troops and your opponents. During the War of 1812 the British captured the American capital, and America went on to win that war. During World War II, Soviets captured the Nazi capital and effectively ended the war in Europe. So, there are reasons to do it, but it in no way assures victory. Capturing the capital is really just a symbol and the country doesn't necessarily fall. For example, Napoleon captured Moscow in September 1812. However, he couldn't stay long and ultimately was devastated in Russia. Great Britain captured Philadelphia, the revolutionary capital, in 1777 and Washington, D.C. in 1814. Neither of those events spelled the end of the USA. In contrast, in the U.S. Civil War, General Grant ignored Richmond and simply tried to destroy Lee's army. That was ultimately a better strategy, one of two reasons. If the opposing government is still operating out of the capital, capturing the capital means capturing the government. Capturing the government means controlling the opposing side. You can imprison their leaders, or kill them, or ransom them in exchange for surrender. If the opposing government isn't operating out of the capital, then capturing the capital lets you install your own puppet government for the country instead. This gives your puppet government a legitimacy bonus. It's not as important as it used to be, but it carries immense symbolic meaning. Strategically it's important because it's the seat of the government, but this only matters if you can capture it with the government staff still there. If they manage to flee, then there's no real strategic purpose in occupying a capital. It still demoralizes the enemy a lot if their capital is captured. However, it's overall not a prerequisite to win a war to occupy the enemy's capital city. Capturing the capital in the modern world would be largely symbolic. It wouldn't be any more or less significant than capturing any other major city. The leaders don't need to be in the same country as one another in order to collaborate and respond in real time, much less the same city. At the first sign of a military presence moving on the capital, the leadership would be at the airport and scattered to the winds rather promptly, because two capital cities tend to contain the administrative districts of a nation. While it's nice to say that nations are more the people than the government, and major cities only survive due to administrative benefits that originate at the top. By capturing the capital where the origins of all that tend to lie, the ability for a nation to administratively survive is almost nil. Capital cities usually are also important centers of transportation and logistical infrastructure. This fact is not only important to the government, but often to the supply chains feeding an economy in the war effort. As such, the loss of a capital city can have an outsized effect on the ability to continue the war, even if the government itself is still intact. Not all nations will be able to maintain advanced command and control functions outside of their headquarters. A national government on the run will be less capable. It's also valuable not just for what it does but for what it represents. Most nations will fight hard to protect their capital. If a capital falls, it's a strong indicator the nation is losing. Government, parliament and top officials like the head of state are usually in the capital city. Until you have a half-functioning government in charge, you haven't captured the whole country, because the parliament and government can still enact laws, maybe assigning extraordinary powers. The top government officials are still there and so on. Because it's the seat of government, most of the ruling and leading the war is going to be done there, and it will be harder to lead the country somewhere else that doesn't have that infrastructure. Also, it's a symbolic thing as well. That country couldn't protect its most important city, that would demoralize their forces. Morale is key in any conflict. Losing your capital, which for many nations is a seat of power, likely and economic center as well as potential a cultural center and symbol, can really damage morale. Once people lose will to fight, the war is over, and taking a capital can go a long way towards that. Anyone saying the government can just relocate hints in modern times it's just symbolic, has zero idea what they're talking about. It's in the sentence, or forcing the main head of the opposition to be pushed out and away. That's kind of the whole point when invading a country. If your goal is to take over a country, The best way to do so is to remove the current seat of power. Said seat of power is typically in the country's capital city. So capturing the capital is the best way of supplanting the current governing body with your own. A lot of important info in this thread, but just to nerd out a second, recently capturing the capital has led to transferring the country's web domains, for example Yemen in 2015. There's obviously the symbolic part of it. You're disrupting their government. They look powerless. Also, most countries are oriented around their capitals. They're massive logistical hubs. You're damaging their ability to wage war. When Russia invaded Ukraine, their goal was to assassinate the leaders and establish themselves as the government. If the government is dead and you have the means to impose your will over the people, you are the government. Morale changes how soldiers fight. That's why the scary weapons and armors existed. Now if you get their capital, imagine their families, lands, king, etc. all under enemies' hands. What is left?